to him, to relate to him, with the removal of barriers such as sin or guilt which stand in his way. And so for that reason, Christians have very often, rightly I think, thought of the death and resurrection of Christ as being right at the centre of the Christian faith, because it is at this point, if you like, that this great act of redemption has taken place, and which we're being asked to respond to in some way.
But it's almost as though you're slipping away from the factual veracity of this and erecting the death of Jesus as almost a kind of poetic, symbolic act. And I've noticed a tendency for theologians to do that a lot, and to sort of almost say, oh, we don't care what really happened. What matters is the symbolic meaning. It's almost as though if, say, at some future date, the double helix model of DNA were ever to be disproved, and then if scientists had become so religiously committed to the idea of the double helix that they would say something like, oh, we don't care whether it's actually true that it's a double helix, but what meaning does the double helix have for us today? Perhaps the affinity of the bases for each other, the purine for the pyrimidine, the way the double helix coils round itself is kind of has meaning for us in terms of a loving relationship. You get the point. I mean, doesn't it actually rather matter that this man was tortured and killed for somebody else's sins, when if he was God, he had the power simply to forgive them or perform some other symbolic act, rather than actually be crucified in this horrendous way?
I think for Christians, the events you've described, the actualities, are immensely important. But I think every event actually needs to be interpreted. In other words, this has happened, was its significance? For example, Caesar crossing the Rubicon is actually more than just a general crossing a river. It is an act of declaration of war against Rome because of its significance. And therefore, what Christians have tried to do is to say there are these events, and here are their significance. So the event, if you like, is the death of Jesus on the cross. Its significance is the demonstration of God's love, the transformation of the human situation, the forgiveness of sins, and so forth. And certainly I wouldn't want to minimize for one moment the pain that Christ suffered, the apparent torture, as you rightly say, he went through. And from a Christian perspective, that is not about glorifying torture. It's not about in any way saying, let's do to other people what they did to Jesus. It's much more saying, look, in Christ we see God entering into the world at its darkest parts. The worst that the world could do, the punishment of Christ, his rejection, his torture, his agony, his death, and so on, then in some sense God entered into those darkest parts of the world in order to redeem it. And certainly, you mentioned earlier I might have been a deist. I hope I'm not, because a deist would simply take the view that God is up there looking down on things, perhaps benignly. But the kind of God I believe in is a God who actually enters into this world, takes on this world at its worst, in order to try and transform it. And that really is part of this gospel of redemption, that in some way God chose to enter this world to bring about its transformation through Christ.
I understand what you believe. I wish I understood why. Thank you very much. I think I do.
That's good.
The question of
suffering. If you feel it flows, I'm very happy to take it.
It's just the last thing.
Cameras at speed.
You said you're not a deist but a Christian. There are, of course, other ways of departing from being a deist. You could be a Jew, you could be a Muslim, you could be a Hindu. They're all different, and they differ in many of exactly the kinds of details that you feel so strongly about. How do you know that the particular faith in which you happen to have been brought up is the right one, rather than just the sort of abstract God of the physicists which we were talking about earlier, which doesn't make all these additional claims? Why Christianity?
Well, I certainly began as an atheist, and therefore when I began to be convinced of the truth of Christianity, it wasn't so much a question of I've been brought up in this way. It's much more, this seemed to me to be the right way. I think part of it is the fact that Christianity offers an explanation not simply the way the world is, but also why there are alternative ways of looking at other religions. And certainly if we take someone like J.R.R. Tolkien, well known for his Lord of the Rings, his point is that we all tell stories to try and make sense of things. And all of these, if you like, are grasping after truth, and some of them realize some of it. But his point is there are shadows there amidst the light. And Tolkien's argument, which I personally find very helpful, is that Christianity offers the narrative, the way of looking at things, which actually in some way brings to fulfillment what we find in other faiths. And so I'd want to treat other faiths with the greatest of respect, but hold personally that what I see in them that is good is brought to fulfillment in Jesus Christ. For that reason, I'd want to dialogue with them, to learn from them, but above all to say that, in my view, these reach their fulfillment in the Christian revelation.
Well, I hope they would want to dialogue with you.
I know, it's a triumph of hope over experience.
What about the problem of evil? What about the fact that there is so much suffering in the world? People say, obviously you'll think naively, and I haven't said it, but people will say things like, where was God in the tsunami? Where was God in the New Orleans hurricane, etc.?
I think Christian theologians, in looking at natural disasters, suffering and so forth, have tended to take two approaches. One is to say, let's try and explain this. And that, I think, doesn't really get us very far, because we can't really make sense of these things. Maybe there's just the way things are. But the other approach they have used, I think, is much more important, is to say that we need to cope with suffering. That, in effect, the real issue is not so much how we make sense of this, but given that people are suffering, what may be said, what may be done to actually make that more bearable. And certainly the Christian view is that of a God who knows suffering at first hand, who's been here before us, who's experienced the worst that the world can throw at in the life and death of Jesus Christ. And I certainly do find that consoling. It also animates me to want to try and do something about those who are suffering at this moment. So it's not simply a question of intellectual reflection, it's about wanting to try and get out there and do something, because I believe that's what God would want me to do.
When you read of tens of thousands of people being killed, drowned, or blown away, whatever it is, and then you read that one child was saved, and the parents thank God for saving this one child, doesn't the irony of it strike you? I mean, that God could have saved all those 10,000 people. Why would he save this one child? I mean, I would hope that he would say he didn't save the one child was just lucky. But there are many people whose faith in God, almost unbelievably, I find, is increased when there's a disaster of this kind, rather than being decreased. I mean, can you get your head around that?
I think I would love to be able to explore the question of whether the world could be made in a different way, so we don't have these seismic shifts. Could we make a world where there weren't these things? Could we make a world in which these shifts didn't take place, with resulting tidal waves and so forth? I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a very significant question all the same. But in response to your question about a child being saved, I think one of the most fundamental instincts in human nature is to want to give thanks for things that happen that they believe to be good things. And certainly I fully take your point that it seems ironic that when many have died we should be thankful for one being saved, and yet for the parents in question that would unquestionably be something they felt overwhelmed by, and would be the most natural thing in the world for them to want to give thanks that their child had been saved.
Of course, and I mean, I would agree with that. I'd agree that the psychological benefit of that is huge. But would you, as a detached scholar and theologian, would you want to say God saved that one child?
I would want to say that God saved that one child. I would also want to say that the parents in question were right to give thanks for that. But I would therefore not want to say, I think, that God was in some way responsible for what happened elsewhere. I'd want to say that rather the limitations of the way the world is lead us to the point where this happened in the first place. In other words, that the key question is, could a world be made in which these volcanoes do not erupt, in which there is no shifting of plates, where there are no tidal waves? And that, I think, is not a question about God. I think it's a question about the way things are.
I can't help feeling you're painting yourself into a rather awkward corner here, because on the one hand you're saying, well, these are plate tectonic events, and could one imagine a world that didn't have plates drifting around and therefore the occasional earthquake and tsunami? And perhaps you can't. But if God has the power to, I mean, I thought, to be consistent, you would say No, the plate tectonics is part of God's creation. God is a creator of a world, a universe in which plate tectonics is part of it, and therefore he can't change that and wouldn't wish to. It would be almost undignified. It would almost be a kind of blasphemy to go in there and start messing around with this perfect creation which he's made. But then you suddenly say, well, he saved the one child. I mean, that seems to me to be completely to undermine the rather